Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's REI Weekly Lesson. I am your host, Greg Helbeck. Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Investing Fast Track podcast. Before I get into today's topic, which is actually buying a property with a non-paying tenant. If you're not familiar with me, I have been a full-time real estate investor now for over 8 years. I've done well over 200 houses. We have a seven-figure business on the East Coast and out here in Reno, and I've got a lot of experience buying and selling houses and being a landlord. So hopefully you get a tremendous amount of value today from the episode. And if you do, if you could always subscribe to our YouTube channel and then share our podcast on the audio platforms out to as many people as you can, it would mean a lot to us here at the Velocity House Buyers team. So how do you buy a house with a non-paying tenant, right? This is something that a lot of people are terrified to do. And I can tell you what, some of the best deals I've done have been because I bought them with a non-paying tenant. So let's just talk about what's a non-paying tenant. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's somebody who's living in the property that you're trying to buy that has not paid rent. Pretty simple. Now, why would you do this? Why would you buy a property from an owner when the tenant isn't paying rent? The first reason is that you can generally get a super deep discount because the landlord in this case is giving their problem to you to deal with. And in order to deal with a problem like that, you need to get a big discount because at least in New York, where I do a lot of my business, it could take a year to evict a non-paying tenant if the tenant knows what they're doing. And that could take 2 years if you're really getting the short end of the stick. So you add a lot of value to the actual landlord that you're buying from if you're willing to take it with a non-paying tenant, because a lot of these landlords are like accidental landlords or they're not professional landlords. So when they have a non-paying tenant, they just put their hands in the air and panic, right? Which is understandable because if you're in New York or in a state where it's hard to do evictions, this could be very costly and stressful. But fortunately, there's a process to do that. There's a way to deal with the tenants. There's a way to be respectable to them and hopefully do a cash for keys situation, which I'll get into in a minute. Number two here is a lot of your competitors are not going to want to do this. There's people in the Hudson Valley where we do a lot of business that just won't touch properties with non-paying tenants because they're afraid to get them out. You're going to eliminate a lot of your competition and other offers if you're communicating to the landlord that you're buying the house from that you're willing to do it with a non-paying tenant, because a lot of the other competitors you're dealing with are probably going to say, I'll give you this price if it's vacant, but if it's not vacant, I don't want to buy it. So you can separate yourself from the competition. Now let's actually get into how do you do this? Like what's the way you go about this? Because you definitely need to do this the right way, because if you do it the wrong way, you can get yourself in trouble. First of all, you got to understand what's your exit strategy going to be, right? If you're flipping the house, you're definitely going to want to have to get that tenant out because you can't really sell a house flip style if there's a non-paying tenant inside. You're going to only be limited to other investors. So you have to get that tenant out if you're flipping the house. Now, if you're renting the house, now this is where it gets interesting. You got to figure out why the tenant's not paying. Are they not paying because they don't have the money? Are they not paying because they don't like their landlord? Once you figure that out, if you're planning to rent that property out in the foreseeable future, you want to get in touch with that tenant and explain to them what's going on, right? You want to tell the tenant, hey, I'm buying the property. The house is going to be trading from the owner to me. I'm planning to rent this property, so I'd love to have you stay here. So you want to be accommodating to that non-paying tenant. You want to tell them, listen, when I buy the property, you're going to have to pay rent because we can't have you live here for free. But a lot of the times what you'll realize is that the tenant is not paying because they just didn't like their landlord, or their landlord didn't fix the property, or whatever the case is. So if you can find out from the tenant that number one, they can live there and they can afford the rent and the rent's reasonable, you can communicate to the tenant and say, listen, I know you had a bad experience with your previous landlord. I do things a lot differently here. I'm planning to improve the property. I'm planning to make your house a lot nicer. And if I do all those things and treat you with respect, would you be open to living in this property still and paying me fair market rent? And a lot of these people, they just want a fresh start. They want to deal with a new person. So sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no. So that would be the next thing, is you just communicate with the tenant. It's always easier to keep a tenant inside the property, assuming they're paying a reasonable rent versus kicking them out. So find out from the tenant what their plans are. If the tenant's telling you they don't plan to pay rent and they don't plan to cooperate and they're just going to be a pain in your butt, instead of going for an eviction right away, which in New York at least takes a very long time, usually 6 months if you're lucky, you offer them cash for keys, which is simply, I'm willing to give you money to get out of this property. Generally speaking, when you're doing this, you want them to go first in terms of a price. So if you say, hey, what would it take for me to get you out of here from a cash standpoint? You want the tenant in this case to give you the first number. Let's say you're planning to give them $5,000 and then they tell you they want $2,000 to leave. Now you just save yourself $3,000. And if they don't tell you a number, you make them an offer and you say, I'm willing to give you $3,000 to get out of here in the next 30 days. Is that something you'd be willing to do? If they say yes, this is so important. If they say yes, you don't just get a little handshake agreement. You sign a stipulation that goes into court. You have the tenant sign a legal document that's prepared from an attorney. And it basically says the tenant is accepting whatever dollar amount you agreed upon to vacate the property. And you take that stipulation agreement and you actually give it to the court, because that way is if the tenant doesn't comply to that agreement, you can get them automatically evicted versus having to then restart the process all over again again and take them through the eviction process. And then that protects you in case that tenant violates that agreement. So let's say they agree to cash for keys. You do that, easy peasy. But if they say, no, I'm not going to do anything, you're going to have to kick me out of here, I'm not going to comply. And this unfortunately happens quite often. In that case, you got to simply just do an eviction. And then that'll probably take you at least a few months anywhere in the country. And if you're in New York or California, that could take you 6 months to a year. The key is here, you have to bake this into your numbers, right? So when you're making that low offer to the landlord, you have to assume the worst and hope for the best. So you got to assume it's going to take you a year to evict them. And you got to make that offer reflect that expense. So in that case, you got to make that offer usually an extra $10,000 lower. And then you got to assume the house is going to be in way worse shape than you thought because the tenant might damage the property. That's pretty much the general scope on how to do it. You want to reach out to the tenant, treat them with respect, see if they're willing to stay in the property. If they're willing to stay in the property, figure out a reasonable rent and reasonable repairs to make the house in better shape so you can charge market rent. If they don't want to do that, do a cash for key situation. If they agree to that, get a stipulation signed in court. If they don't want to do that and they're just going to sit there and make you kick them out, you got to go through the eviction process with an attorney. That's the worst case scenario. But honestly, if you put that into your numbers, it is what it is. But the key here, like I said in the beginning of this video, is that when you are willing to buy properties with non-paying tenants, non-cooperative tenants, you can get really good deals and you could absolutely do very well from an investment standpoint because not a lot of competition, like I mentioned, is going to be willing to do that. And if you know how to do it, hopefully this podcast can help you, but can separate you from your competitors so you can ultimately get more deals. So I'm going to share with you actually a quick example on me doing this. And I'm going to tell you how it ended up working out in my favor. I bought a property from an owner who had a non-paying tenant. This was years ago. They didn't pay for 2 years. I bought the property completely sight unseen. I knew it was probably beat up inside. Ended up closing on it with a hard money loan, which is basically a bank that funds real estate investors. And I reached out to the tenant and I said, hey, would you be down to just pay some rent for now? Because at the time, this was during COVID. You couldn't even legally evict people. They said they would. I let them ride out like super cheap rent for 6 months. I went to go raise the rent because I had to refinance out of my hard money loan and they didn't comply. So then I ended up going through the eviction process. That took another year and a half. I think they just ended up leaving. We didn't have to go to a full-blown court case. They trashed the property. It was already in terrible shape, but they just probably made it worse. And then I renovated from top to bottom. I put a full market rent tenant in there and they're still in there to this day. They're about to renew their lease in a couple months. And that was an absolute win because the landlord got relieved from that problem tenant. And I bought that property for 125 grand. I put probably 40 grand into it. And now that property is worth like $280,000 to $290,000. So overall, fairly good investment property, mainly in terms of the equity, because I probably owe on that house 118 grand and it's worth 290. So that's how you buy a property with a non-paying tenant. The last thing I'll mention here before I wrap this up is landlords get a bad reputation, right? A lot of landlords, they're viewed upon as greedy pigs, and there certainly are some greedy pigs out there, don't get me wrong, but you got to treat people like humans and you got to treat them with respect. Just because they're not paying rent doesn't mean they're a bad person. You approach them from a very empathetic perspective. You figure out why they're not paying rent. You try to help them out. You try to help them move. And then if they don't want to comply, then you obviously have to evict, but don't just go in there being a crazy cowboy and bossing people around. That's not the right thing to do. Offer them solutions, go above and beyond. And if they agree, it'll be a lot easier. And if they don't agree, you did everything in your control, and then you have to do the eviction, unfortunately. So hopefully this was a helpful video. So if you did get value from this, if you could do me a favor, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, share the podcast if you're listening on audio platforms, share it on social media. And if you're in the Hudson Valley, Reno, San Diego, or Delaware, and you have a house you want to wholesale me, or you want to wholesale together on a JV basis, any deal you have in those areas, I'd love to hear from you. Greg at velocityhousebuyers.com is my email address, or you can just hit me up on Instagram at Grego_37. I hope you got value from today's podcast, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.